And welcome back to part 2 of the Exodus lecture. So in the last lecture we were looking at the Exodus events. So now let's carry on and see what else we can find, these links between the Hyksos and the Israelites. So in another passage from the same book, this is all from Against Apion, which is written by Josephus Flavius, where he comes to the defense of the Jewish people. And he came to the defense so vigorously of the Jewish people that he probably got himself exiled from Rome, because he fell foul of the emperor of Rome at that stage and disappears from history. And it may have been because of this book, Against Apion, his defense of the Jewish people. Anyway, in another passage, Josephus again talks about the Hyksos, and he says here, Manetho promised to interpret the Egyptian history out of their sacred writings, and said our people, that's the Israelites of course, had come into Egypt many tens of thousands in number and subdued its inhabitants. He further confessed that we went out of the country afterwards and settled in that country which is now called Judea, and there built Jerusalem and its temple. Now, thus far, he followed the ancient records. Now, this is interesting. Again, we have to pass this story because Manetho is not talking about Israelites here. He's talking about the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. So Manetho is talking about the Hyksos, and Josephus Flavius says they are our people, the Israelites. And the Israelites had come into Egypt and subdued its inhabitants. So there's a dichotomy for starters. I mean, if we're talking about the Hyksos as Manetho was, of course they subdued its inhabitants, because that's what the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt did. They subdued the native Egyptians and lived there for 500 years. But Josephus Flavius is talking about the Israelites, and he is saying that the Israelites subdued the Egyptians. And then later on, of course, they'll all say that the Israelites were slaves of the evil Egyptians. You see the dichotomy here. But why this? So yeah, why indeed? Why this slaves story? Why did they suddenly say that, the poor Israelites were just slaves? Well, I think this is because, well, it has other political and social ramifications as well, but I think this is because Josephus also conflates the Hyksos Israelites with the people of Amarna. And if you don't know who they are, Amarna was the capital city of Pharaoh Akhenaten. And so I call his people, his followers, the people of Amarna. And now we have a conflation between the Hyksos Israelites and their exodus, and the people of Amarna, the people of Akhenaten, and their exodus. So the story goes on, and this is the same passage in the same book. And so Manetho, through Josephus, now says, Pharaoh Amenophis employed Amenophis of Papis, who got together all of those in Egypt that had any defect in their bodies, lepers of course, numbering 80,000, and sent them to the quarries which are on the east bank of the Nile, that they may work in them and might be separated from the rest of the Egyptians. Right, okay, so this doesn't sound like we're talking about the Hyksos anymore, because this is not really a part of Hyksos history. East bank of the Nile, quarry. And Amenophis, of course, is most probably Amenhotep, because it's just a Greek rendering of Amenhotep. And so the pharaoh it's talking about here is Amenhotep III, the father of Pharaoh Akhenaten, who founded the city of Amarna in about 1350 BC. And so this is probably what it's talking about. So again, let's have a look at this particular passage. So Amenophis of Papis, who was working for Pharaoh Amenhotep III, got together all of those in Egypt that had any defect in their bodies. Later on, they're called lepers, numbering about 80,000. Okay, so this is not real lepers. This is theological lepers, pariahs, outcasts in society, numbering 80,000, and sent them to the quarries on the east bank of the Nile. So what was the famous quarry on the east bank of the Nile? It was the new city of Amarna, that they might work in them and be separated from the rest of the Egyptians. Well, this is exactly what Akhenaten did. And here is obviously Akhenaten. This is exactly what Akhenaten did. He took his 80,000 outcasts from society. And they were outcasts, of course. Remember that Amenhotep IV, Akhenaten, was a monotheist. He was the guy that eventually closed all of the temples in Egypt and established a new religion, the religion of the Aten. So, of course, he and his followers were pariahs. They were outcasts. And they were sent, probably not entirely voluntary, they were sent to this location on the east bank of the Nile, where they set up their own little commune. And they had to build for themselves, because there was nothing there, it was just a bare plain. They had to build for themselves a new city. And that new city was called Amarna. In Akhenaten's day, the city was called Akhetaten. And it was a quarry, because they had to build it from scratch. They had to make all of the mud bricks. They had to hew all of the stones to make the temples, to make the palaces, to make their own houses. It was just a quarry for 2 decades. It resounded to the hammering of chisels on stone because they had to make this new city. So yes, this is Akhenaten. And of course, Akhenaten didn't look like this. This sort of long face and almond-shaped eyes and all of the rest of it, the strange body, was just a fashion. It was actually based on the image of the gods. This is what they thought the gods looked like. And so Akhenaten portrayed himself in the image of the gods, which is why we have this imagery here. But the text goes on. Manetho further said that there were some learned priests that were polluted with this leprosy, but that Amenophis was afraid that the gods would be angry at him and at the king if there was any violence against them. He also predicted that certain people would come to the assistance of these polluted wretches and would conquer Egypt and keep it in their possession for 13 years. Again, this is talking about Amarna. So the learned priests who were polluted with leprosy were not real lepers. Of course, they were theological lepers. These were the Atenist priests of Pharaoh Akhenaten. And this gives some interesting details, because it shows to us, if this is really talking about the founding of Amarna by Pharaoh Akhenaten, it gives us the reason why he was allowed to do this. Because it's not entirely clear why he went to Amarna and set up this new town, how he was able to do it, why he was allowed to do it. Because remember, he was not Pharaoh at that time. His father was the Pharaoh, Amenhotep III. And eventually they ruled in a co-regency for a number of years. So Akhenaten went to this town and set up his new cult following in this new city. Why was he allowed to do it? Well, this tells us why he was allowed to do it. It's because Amenophis, probably both the administrator called Amenophis or Amenhotep and the king Amenhotep III, were afraid that the gods would be angry with them if there was any violence against these lepers, against Akhenaten. And he also predicted that certain people would come to their assistance of these polluted wretches and would conquer Egypt and keep it in their possession if they moved against Akhenaten. And you'll find a lot of Egyptologists are skeptical about this because they're saying, who would come to the aid of these polluted lepers, because they don't understand the story. They don't even understand who the lepers were, let alone the rest of the story. But of course, the people who would come to their assistance were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt, who had already emigrated on the Great Exodus and were already in either the very north of Egypt or in Jerusalem. And I also say that some of them had gone off across to the Levant and some of the Mediterranean islands as well. And these are the people who had come to the assistance of these polluted wretches, Akhenaten and his followers, if there was any violence against them. Because there was a genetic link, there was a family link between the Hyksos and Pharaoh Akhenaten. They were a part of the same family, which I go into in the books. This is pretty much what happened. It says that these wretches would conquer Egypt and keep it in their possession for 13 years. Well, Akhenaten was in power for about 15 years. We're not quite sure exactly how long he was in power, but on my calculation, which I made in my book, Scota, Egyptian Queen of the Scots, I said that Akhenaten was in a co-regency for a number of years. I forget how many, about 5 years, with his father, and then he was in charge of Egypt as the sole pharaoh for 15 years before going into exile. And yes, we get this from the continuation of this story. So Manetho goes on saying, through Josephus is telling this story. And he says, after which Manetho writes, after those that were sent to work in the quarries had continued in that miserable state for a long while, the king was desired that he would set apart the city of Avaris, which was then left desolate by the shepherds, for their habitation and protection. Now again, we need to pass this one as well. So Manetho is saying that these people had been in the quarries, that's in the city of Amarna, building this new city on the east bank of the Nile, in that miserable state for a long while. The king, now this is the next king now, because we've moved on a few years, and the next king would be King Tutankhamun, who, remember, was no longer an Artanist. He had been persuaded, bullied basically, by the aristocracy and the clergy to return to the old gods. He had forgotten about the Aten and had gone back to the old gods. And the king desired that they would set apart the city of Avaris, which had belonged to the shepherds, the Hyksos, for their habitation and protection. Now this is interesting because this is telling us something about the city, about the regime of Pharaoh Akhenaten, which is still widely under dispute because lots of people don't know what happened to Akhenaten and his people. But here it's clearly stating that the king, Tutankhamun, wanted them out of Amarna, because Amarna was sitting right in the middle of Egypt. It was probably very divisive. We have this rebel cult city sitting in the middle of Egypt on the Nile. Everybody had to pass by this city. It probably restricted trade and all sorts of things. They wanted Akhenaten out of that position in Amarna. And so, as it says, they gave them a place in Avaris, Pyramesi, which had been the capital city of the shepherds, the Hyksos, for their habitation and protection. So Akhenaten and the people of Amarna went to Avaris. That's where they went to. And remember that there is no evidence whatsoever of Akhenaten and Nefertiti dying and being buried in Amarna or Thebes for that matter. They've done all of this research, and they keep saying that KV55 may well be Akhenaten, but KV55 cannot be Akhenaten. I still think that the mummy of KV55 is too young to be Akhenaten, and the genetic research they did demonstrated that it most probably was not Akhenaten. In fact, it couldn't be Akhenaten, but it could be Smenkhara, who was another of these ethereal pharaohs who reigned during the Amarna era. We don't entirely know his parentage, but he was related to the Amarna pharaohs, and he only ruled for a couple of years. The body, the mummy in KV55 could well be Smenkhara, but it couldn't genetically be Akhenaten. Despite what Zaki Hawass says in his many pronouncements on this subject, KV55 cannot be Akhenaten. So there is no evidence of Akhenaten and Nefertiti in Egypt as far as we know. Their tombs were not used. They both had tombs at Amarna, which were made, and they were never finished. There is no evidence for Akhenaten and Nefertiti in Thebes, in the Valley of the Kings or the Valley of the Queens. Why is that? Well, because this text is telling us exactly why that is. It is saying that Tutankhamun sent them into exile to Avaris, Pyramisi. So if we want to find the tombs of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, we should go to Avaris, which is up by Zagazig in the Nile Delta. Or perhaps to Tanis, because remember, in the talk on King Solomon and King David, most of Avaris was dismantled. They actually dismantled the entire city and took it up to Tanis, which is about, I don't know, another 50, 70 kilometers further north. So that city was dismantled and taken up to Tanis. So if we're looking for the tomb of Akhenaten, it will be found up in Avaris or Tanis. And finally, the text finishes on this little note, which is interesting. And it says, "It was also reported that the priest who ordained their politics and laws was by birth of Heliopolis, and his name was Osaseph, from Osiris, who was the god of Heliopolis. But then when he was gone over to these people, his name was changed, and he was called Moses." Right, so now we know this is the biblical Moses. This is what it's talking about. It's not talking about any old Moses. It's talking about the biblical Moses, who was the leader of these people on this Exodus. Although it's not entirely clear by this stage whether they're talking about the Exodus of the Hyksos or the Exodus of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Remember, what they've done here is they've just conflated these two Exodus events. They've got this great Exodus, the Exodus of the Hyksos people, and the Exodus of Akhenaten and Nefertiti, and they're all in the same passage now. The same passage. This is from Against Apion 126. And they've just flowed from one Exodus straight into the story about the other Exodus. And in the biblical accounts, they've conflated the two into one story. So you're never quite sure if they're talking about the great Exodus, the Exodus of the Hyksos, or the small Exodus of Akhenaten and his 80,000 lepers and maimed priests, as they call them. So, and elsewhere in these stories, so Moses was called Osaseph, which is an Egyptian name. We'll have a look at that in a minute. But elsewhere in the same texts, Josephus, again quoting Manetho, says that Moses was also called Tisathin, and Osaseph, of course, and Joseph, and it looks like he's talking about the biblical Joseph, him of the coat of many colours, was called Petaseph. And remember, these are Egyptian names. So Moses means son. That's what it means in Egyptian. Never mind what they say about out of the water and all of that sort of business, which is what it says in the biblical text. Moses is a very common Egyptian pharaonic name, and it means son of. That's why we get Tuthmoses and Ahmoses and all of those sort of names. And Seth, again, means son, son of. And normally they're the son of a god, of course. Tuthmoses was the son of Thoth. Ahmoses was the son of the moon. Ra-Moses was the son of the sun god Ra. And so we have two proper Egyptian names for these famous people from the biblical accounts. We have Moses, who was called Osaseph, meaning the son of Osiris, and Joseph, who was called Petaseph, which means the son of Ptah, the Egyptian god Ptah. And that was probably correct because Joseph was from Heliopolis, and he was probably the high priest of Heliopolis. Remember, he married the high priest of Heliopolis' daughter, and he had the coat of many colors. So Joseph was probably high priest of Heliopolis. And so this link to Ptah is not surprising because the temple in Tanis, which was the temple, I say, temple and city that belonged to King David and King Solomon, was called the Hetkar Ptah, which is the temple of Ptah. And, well, that's why Joseph might have been called the son of Ptah, Petaseph. And this might have a link into the New Testament as well. Just to link all of this together, as we like to do, it's all part of the same story because, Jesus came out of Egypt I have called my son. So the New Testament account is all linked into Egypt. That's why Jesus was called the Egyptian false prophet. You'll have to look at the previous lectures for that because it's quite obvious that Jesus was called the Egyptian false prophet both in the gospel stories and also in the works of Josephus Flavius. Anyway, one of the names we have here is Petaseph, the son of Ptah. And that might give us a link to the gospel Peter, Saint Peter, because his name means stone. We all know that. His name means stone from the Greek Petra, meaning stone. And he was also called Kephas from the Aramaic, meaning stone. But being interested in languages, where did the Greeks get their word Petra from? Because I've found many links in my previous works between the Greek language and the Egyptian, and between Greek and Aramaic. So where did the Greeks get their word Petra from, meaning stone? Well, it so happens that Ptah was the god of architects. And the god of architects working in stone, Ptah and Petra, it's the same spelling pretty much, especially if you do it in the Aramaic, it's the same spelling. So Ptah refers to stones and architects, just as Peter does, or Petra does. And remember that Jesus was also an architect, just as Ptah was the god of architects. Because Jesus was called, well, he wasn't called a carpenter, as we've said before. Jesus was called a tekton. And a tekton doesn't really mean carpenter, it means architect. You can hear the name in the English. Architect, he was called a tekton. And Jesus was not an operative architect. He didn't work in stone. He was a speculative architect. He was a Mason. He was a Freemason. And we've been through this before. That's why the raising of Lazarus is exactly the same as a Masonic third-degree initiation. The Israelite Exodus was the Hyksos Exodus. And the Israelite people were the Hyksos people, exactly as Josephus Flavius says. And so these two Exodus events were identical, except for their date. So the traditional Exodus is 1250 during the reign of Ramesses the Great, but it actually happened, according to real history, in 1570, 1580 BC, during the time of the Hyksos Exodus out of Egypt, which was under the reign of Ahmose I. And the Hyksos left Egypt the same as the Israelites left Egypt. And this is confirmed in the Tempestella. We talked about the Tempestella before. This is confirmed in the Tempest Stela of Ahmose I, the Pharaoh of the Exodus, the Upper Egyptian Pharaoh. So this is not the Hyksos Pharaoh, this is the Pharaoh that threw the Hyksos out of Egypt. And the strange thing was that the Tempest Stela of Ahmose I seemed, when I first read it, to have quotes from the Exodus, from the biblical Exodus account, on the Tempest Stela, about the Israelites being given the gold and the silver and the oil and the cloth in order to leave Egypt. Materials they used then to go and make the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant. Tempest Stela says exactly the same about the Hyksos. They were also given the gold and the silver and the cloth and the oil in order to leave Egypt. They were being given tribute. There was a military stalemate. They couldn't finish off the job militarily. So they said, right, take this tribute and go. So they were paid off, basically. They were paid off. Both of them were paid off. The Hyksos and the Israelites were both paid off in order to leave Egypt. And I thought this was a biblical quote. But on second thoughts, perhaps not. What I think, because there are some differences between the two accounts, and what I think it is it's eyewitness events of the same event by two different scribes. One from the north and one from the south, one from the Hyksos and one from the Theban Egyptians. And they both wrote their own account of what happened. And so we get the two accounts on the Tempest Stela and in the book of Exodus. Now, I'm not going to go through that because it's long and it's complex, and I think we've done quite enough here already. So if you want to read about that, you'll have to have a look at that in the book Tempest and Exodus. So again, we come back to why will theologians and Egyptologists not mention this? Well, I think from the theological perspective, I think the reason is obvious, because this represents a fundamental change to standard classical Judaism. The Israelites were Egyptians, Hyksos Egyptians. They were not defenseless slaves. They possessed modern weapons. That's, the Hyksos were known for their modern weaponry. And they subjugated the Egyptians in Lower Egypt, as they claim in their own, as the history actually says of the Hyksos. And they were educated people as well. They were not, simple slaves in Egypt. They were educated people. The Rind mathematical papyrus is a Hyksos text. And, well, as you can see, from this image, it's actually several pages. It's not one page, it's many pages. But the Rind mathematical papyrus contains algebra, geometry, and complex mathematics, all in fractions, because they didn't have decimals in those days, all in fractions. Long before, the Muslims claim, during the golden age of Islam that they invented algebra. Sorry, rubbish, as usual. Golden age of Islam never existed, didn't happen. You'll have to look at my paper I wrote on academia.edu about that. Not invented by Islam. In fact, Islam never invented anything, not one single thing. Everything they claim to be an Islamic invention was a prior invention by the Greeks, by the Romans, by the Persians, and also by the Indians. Everything they claim was a prior invention that they adopted in the 8th to, say, 10th centuries AD. And so, yeah, they claim that they invented algebra. Sorry, this is algebra, and this is from the Hyksos era. This is from 1500 no, probably earlier than that, 1800 BC, and they have algebra and geometry on the Rhind mathematical papyrus. So this is an Israelite document. It's a Hyksos Israelite document. So they were not persecuted slaves. They were dominant invaders in Egypt, which is why they were able to plunder the Egyptians before they left for Jerusalem. And the idea of this persecution was taken from Akhenaten and Amarna. As we've just seen, we have this little story about the founding of Amarna with 80,000 lepers who were forced to work in the quarries on the east bank of the Nile, the founding of the city of Amarna. But those 80,000 followers of Pharaoh Akhenaten had to make their own city. They were stuffed in this little plain on the east bank of the Nile, and they were forced to make bricks, stone bricks and mud bricks for the Pharaoh. And of course, Akhenaten wanted everything to be built tomorrow. He didn't want to wait for his new city. He wanted it all built tomorrow. And so he was shouting at his people, "You are idle, you are idle. You must make mud bricks even if you cannot find any straw." You remember the quote from the book of Exodus. So, and the Israelites, the book of Exodus blames that on the evil Pharaoh. And they were sort of right. But what they won't say is the evil Pharaoh was their own king. He was Pharaoh Akhenaten, who was trying to push his own people into building his city much quicker than they possibly could. That's how they've distorted this history. But it is real history. It's the history of the founding of Amarna by Pharaoh Akhenaten. That's why the god of the Israelites was called the Arden. Okay, you're probably not familiar with that. The God of the Israelites was called Yahweh, of course, and he was called El, and we've already seen this. He was called El, Elohim, Shaddai. But the God of the Israelites was also called the Arden. And that name comes from Akhenaten. The god of Akhenaten was the Aten, or the Arden, and that name has been used by the Israelites for their God. It's the same God, it's the same people, it's the same religion, because remember that Akhenaten was the first monotheist. He was the Pharaoh who banned all of the gods of Egypt. And he was iconoclast. He destroyed all the images as well of the gods. Exactly the same as the Israelites, who were the first monotheists, because they were taking the religion of Pharaoh Akhenaten. So we have these two exoduses, and the biblical account has conflated them into one. The Hyksos Exodus and the Akhenaten Amarna Exodus, and the Bible has simply conflated these two into one story, one event. So the Hyksos then go off onto their exodus. They set off from Egypt and they head off towards Judea. Well, bearing in mind, of course, that Egypt quite often refers to Upper Egypt, not to Lower Egypt. We get this in the books of Josephus Flavius quite often. When he talks about Egypt, he means Thebes. He doesn't necessarily mean the whole of Egypt as we understand it. So the Hyksos are going off from Egypt, from Middle Egypt, from Upper Egypt, and they're going up into the very north of the delta when they were forced up towards Avaris. And they have 40 years in the wilderness, supposedly crossing the Sinai Peninsula. But they could not be crossing the Sinai Peninsula. You could not spend 40 years in a tented encampment in the Sinai Peninsula because it's a desert. It's a continuation of the Sahara Desert. They wouldn't last 4 weeks in the Sinai Peninsula, let alone 40 years. So what does this mean? Well, it's not complete fantasy. It's based on an initiation. It's the same as Moses spending 40 days up on Mount Sinai and Jesus spending 40 days in nights in the wilderness. It's a sign of initiation. It's a cipher for those who have been illuminated. Because this is one of the big secrets of Judaism. And that great unmentioned secret is the location of Mount Sinai. Because how did the Israelites, the Jews, lose their sacred mountain? I mean, this is the mountain where God lived. It was the most important aspect of their religion. And the Jews record everything. Everything is written in their books. They are assiduous record keepers. So how do they lose the location of their sacred mountain? The answer is they didn't lose it at all. They just don't want you to know where it is or what it is. In fact, it's very easy to find if you have an open mind, if you don't just follow the text blindly, as most theologians and historians, they're just as guilty. If you follow the text blindly, you're never going to see anything. If you have an open mind, the answer is obvious. It's childishly obvious. And the way to find it is to have a look at the attributes of this sacred mountain, Mount Sinai. So it's said to be the largest mountain in the region. It was small enough to cordon off because you weren't allowed to touch it. So this is a mountain that sort of comes out of the ground at a fairly sharp angle, obviously. It wasn't just a slowly rising ground that went into a hill. This was a sharp mountain that you could possibly touch, and they had to cordon it off, so you were not allowed to touch it. It was sharp, it was difficult to climb. It was on the edge of a desert. It had a cave inside it where the God lived. God wasn't sitting on the top of Mount Sinai. More often than not, he's said to be living inside Mount Sinai. And at the base of Mount Sinai, there was this dark blue pavement that was smooth and shiny and sparkling and looked like the night sky. So what mountain has all of these attributes, especially this odd pavement at the bottom? I mean, what mountain has a glassy blue-black pavement at the bottom? Sounds impossible, doesn't it? It's fantasy. They're making it up. It's all mythology. No, it's real. And the answer is to be found in a biblical omission. Yes, you can find something by its presence, but you can also find something by its omission, the fact that it's missing from the historical record. And that thing is, if you get a computerized Bible, or if you go to a concordance and you just type in Great Pyramid, or even Pyramid, just type in Pyramid and do a search function. And it'll churn its way through the Old Testament and it will say, nothing found. Isn't that a bit odd? Here is the greatest wonder of the ancient world, the greatest wonder almost of the modern world, but certainly the greatest wonder of the ancient world, and it's not mentioned in the whole of the Old Testament. But the Israelites lived in Egypt for 400 years, 500 years. Joseph, him of the coat of many colours, was high priest of Heliopolis. He was prime minister of Egypt. And Heliopolis is but an arrow's arc away from Giza. You can see Giza from Heliopolis. Heliopolis is mentioned many times in the Old Testament. They call it On, which is the original Egyptian name for the city and the temple, which was An. And in the biblical account, it's called On, and the Greeks called it Heliopolis. So Heliopolis is well known. And Joseph was probably the high priest of Heliopolis, but he never mentions the pyramids. He never went to the pyramids for a cup of tea, the greatest wonder in the ancient world, looking. I mean, this is an era when most people lived in mud huts. And okay, the temples of Egypt must have looked magnificent. But the Great Pyramid It's 280 cubits high, 146 meters. It's vast. It must have been a true wonder of the ancient world, and that's never mentioned in the biblical story. Well, actually, it was. It was mentioned on many occasions in the biblical story. It's just that they call it Mount Sinai instead. So Mount Sinai was the Great Pyramid, Mount Horeb was the second pyramid, Mount Hor is the third pyramid. And of course, the Great Pyramid conforms with all of those attributes of Mount Sinai. It was the largest mountain in the region, the largest pyramid in the region. It was small enough to cordon off because, yeah, you can put a fence around the pyramid so you're not allowed to touch the sides of it. It's sharp, it's difficult to climb. It's on the edge of a desert. And there is a cave inside it, which was always open. The original shaft that went down to the base of the pyramid was always open. We know that from Strabo talks about it. Long before the casing blocks were torn off the pyramid by the Muslim when they were in charge of Egypt. Strabo says that the passageway all the way down to the cave at the bottom of the pyramid was always open. It was only the upper chambers that were concealed and not known about. And then that last thing, the pavement at the base of Mount Sinai. Well, it just so happens if you go down to the bottom on the east face of the Great Pyramid, you will find the great black basalt pavement. And so here at the base of the Great Pyramid, Mount Sinai, you will find this enormous, great, smooth, perfectly flat, black basalt pavement that did indeed look like the night sky exactly as it's mentioned in the Exodus story. This is another reason, I suppose, for linking the Israelites with the Hyksos. I mean, once you start doing this, all of these other things start dropping out of the woodwork that classical Jews and even Christians won't really approve of. And this is another of those problems, that the primary Israelite temple was the Giza Plateau. That's where their primary temple was. Remember, I'm not sure if you follow all of this, but the pyramids were not tombs. No mummy has ever been found in a pyramid, and especially the great megalithic pyramids were not tombs. They have no inscriptions inside them. No pharaoh in his right mind would ever be buried in a tomb that did not glorify his name. And of course, the walls of all of the megalithic pyramids are completely bare. They were not tombs. They were temples. Temples to the cosmos, that's for sure. They were gnomons that their shadows and so on could regulate, the months and the days of the year. As above, so below. They did mimic the heavens above in being the belt of Orion and all of that sort of business. And they were astronomical observation points. The top of the Great Pyramid always had a flat top on the top of it. And it probably had a set of steps up the side of it, because it was the greatest astronomical observation point in the whole of Egypt. And for a religion that revered the heavens and the cosmos and the movement of those heavens and the constellations and the zodiac, which they did, you would need something like the Great Pyramid as your great observatory. And that's what it was. That's why when we come to later Judaism and the life of Jesus, and we've already been through this, the primary symbol of later Judaism was the zodiac, which is why we have that great zodiac on the shores of the Sea of Galilee at Hamat Tavera, which we've already talked about. So you see how Judaism starts straying away from its roots as soon as we mention that the Israelites were the Hyksos. And so, where were we? Oh, we were talking about the number 40, weren't we? So why this 40 years in the wilderness and the 40 days and nights in the wilderness and all that sort of business. It's a sign of initiation into the secrets, the metrology of the Giza Plateau. Why? Because the Great Pyramid itself is a 40 times copy of pi. So here we have an illustration of that. And you can see pi on the left. We're just using the fractional approximation of pi here, 22 over 7. And that can give you, if you draw it graphically, you can end up with a little pyramid. So the pyramid on the left is pi, 22 over 7. If you multiply by 40, then you get the Great Pyramid. It becomes 880 over 280. And then you have to multiply this by 2, because the Great Pyramid is actually, mathematically speaking, it's an image of a circle. It is 2 pi r. So you have to multiply the 22 over 7 and the 880 over 280. You have to multiply that by 2, because the Great Pyramid is a circle, mathematically speaking. And so we get 1,760 over 280. And 1,760 is the circumference of the Great Pyramid in royal cubits, and 280 is the height of the Great Pyramid in royal cubits. It is the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. And so if you mention the number 40 in your reign length, your age, or the number of days and nights you've spent in the wilderness, you are indicating that you've been initiated into the secrets of the Giza Pyramid, because the Giza Pyramid is a 40 times multiple of the mathematical constant pi. It means you understand the world. It means you understand geometry. It means you understand the basics of mathematics. You've been initiated into the mystery school of the Israelite Freemasons. Because as I said, Jesus was a Freemason. We've already talked about that in previous lectures. And strangely enough, that same figure, that same number is still in use today. That 1,760. Do you recognize it? Again, this is where it's difficult sometimes to join the dots. If you don't know all of the numbers, it's very difficult to join up all the dots. But 1,760 is 1 imperial mile. So the Great Pyramid is 1,760 cubits around the base, and the imperial mile is 1,760 yards in length. We're still using the same measurement system that was used to build the pyramids 10 or 12,000 years ago, probably 10,000 years ago. Because, why are they the same? Because they are based on the same metrological system. They are both based upon pi. They are both pi units. That's why the imperial chain is 22 yards and the imperial rod is 5.5 yards. It's all based upon pi. Pi is 22 over 7. So 22 is the length of one chain. 220 yards is 1 furlong. And 5.5 yards, why would you ever want a length, a measurement of length of 5.5 yards? I mean, who wants fractions in their basic units of length? Well, it's obvious. If you divide 22 by 4, a quarter of pi, as it were, is 5.5. And that's where the rod came from. It's all based upon pi. So we're still using the same measurement system that was used to build the pyramids. And so the bottom figure on this is that the Great Pyramid is mentioned in the Torah many times. They just call it Mount Sinai. So Mount Sinai was never lost at all. It is still there at Giza. And probably some people know that it's still there at Giza. They just don't want you to know that, because it changes story too much. They don't want you to know. They changed the story because the Israelites blamed everything on the Egyptians. After they were thrown out of Egypt on the Great Exodus, they blamed all of their misfortunes on the Egyptians. So they could not really admit that they were Egyptians themselves, that they were a powerful people who subjugated the Egyptians, that they had been polytheists, that their religion and language was substantially Egyptian. None of that could be admitted. And this persecution, it was the horrible Egyptians that threw us out of Egypt. That persecution card is a very powerful binding force. It groups people together, it's us against them. It was the big bully Egyptians who persecuted us, so we must stick together against them. Which is why the Jews are still recognizably a distinct ethnic group, because they identify with their particular group. This is identity politics or tribalism. I'd rather call it tribalism, but in the modern world they call it identity politics. It's the same as being played out today in modern politics with the postmodern identity politics. Intersectionality, they call it, which is a very peculiar philosophy where you can blame all of your failings on someone else. Just as the Israelites blamed the evil Egyptians for all of their misfortunes. So they could not admit that they themselves were Egyptians, even if Josephus Flavius, their most famous historian, said that they were Egyptians. And this even happens today. I mean, none of this is actually ancient history. This is all very modern history. Even today, a year ago, maybe 2 years ago now, we tried to place this information onto Wiki by placing a quote, these quotes that we've already seen from Josephus Flavius, placing these quotes on Wiki to say that Josephus Flavius said that the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. Just 2 lines and a quote from Josephus, and it wasn't allowed. It was deleted and deleted. 20 times it was deleted from Wiki. And then because I kept putting it back onto Wiki, I was banned from Wiki. I was thrown off completely because I was trying to put a quote from Josephus Flavius onto Wiki that said the Israelites were the Hyksos pharaohs of Egypt. So you won't know about this. Well, maybe you personally will, but many people out there will not know about this because their first reference point is Wiki. And Wiki will not tell you this because the gatekeepers of Wiki won't allow it to be put on Wikipedia. So if you're a contributor to Wikipedia, try putting it on. Let's try and get 100 different people to put this information onto Wiki. We were doing it on the Exodus page, I think, for Wiki. So let's try again, see if we can get that information there. But at present, that information is not there. It's not on Wiki. It's not in virtually all reference books. In fact, I don't think it's in any reference book has anyone so closely allied the Israelites and the Hyksos as I have done in my books. So, okay, so let's try and be honest for a change. I know academia is not honest, historians are not honest, theologians are not honest, but let's us be honest. The Israelites were the Hyksos Egyptians of Egypt. Josephus Flavius says so, and the archaeology of the region agrees with him. And if you don't like that truth, go and live in a cave somewhere, but don't teach our children misinformation and lies in order to perpetuate these misinformations and lies. And I said this before about the King Arthur misinformation because there was so much misinformation coming out of academia about the King Arthur. It's time, really, to defund the humanities departments within academia. It really is. Anyway, after that small little rant, I've got that out of my system now. I do hope you've enjoyed this lecture and can join us again next time.